Welcome to Crawlspace. I'm Tim here today with Lance. Lance, how are you today?
I'm doing fantastic today. Thank you so much for asking. I think our listeners are going to be doing great after they hear this interview with a new friend of the show, this award-winning reporter from ABC. He's got a great podcast of his own, but he's bringing a story to the table that is local to you and I, Tim, and it's it has gained a ton of traction globally. For better or worse. But Tim, for better or worse, how are you today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for asking. And yeah, very excited to introduce this conversation with Brad Mielke, who is the host of The Crime Scene Weekly. And that is a new podcast from ABC News Audio. So definitely check that out. It is very good. And Brad is covering the Karen Read case, the Karen Read murder trial right now as we're recording this on April 22nd, 2025. The trial is about to get started. So this conversation is pretty much completely about the Karen Read case and the trial. And boy, it is a wild case, isn't it?
There's a lot going on here. There's one camp that we talk about, which is the Occam's razor method of thinking, that the simplest solution is probably the most likely solution. If anyone's not familiar with Karen Read's case, she is on trial for the second time for hitting her boyfriend, who is a police officer. This happened in Massachusetts in the winter in January of 2022. And she's on trial, like I said, for the second time. And on the surface, it should be very cut and dry. It should be open and close. An accidental vehicular homicide after they had been drinking. They went to a house that was occupied by a lot of other police officers. And when Karen decided to leave this party, apparently allegedly she had backed the vehicle into her boyfriend, and he had then subsequently died of a head injury and hypothermia.
Right. So that's John O'Keefe. Yeah, so this incident took place January 29, 2022, and Karen Read is 45 and a former adjunct professor at Bentley, and she pled not guilty to second-degree murder and other charges. And the first trial was a hung jury, and so this trial is, we're trying to get a real resolution. It is kind of a wild case because of, well, I guess we'll let Brad discuss, because there's just a lot to it. And there's factions on both sides of this that are very passionate. And it really makes for a compelling story right here in our backyards, Lance.
For sure. And there's a lot to it. And we do discuss the details of the moment itself, of the actual alleged murder itself, but we do get a little bit more into how the media is portraying it. And when you say that there's a lot to it, yeah, you can make out a lot to it, like certain independent journalists have done in this area, who we get into later on. But there could be nothing to it. It could be very simple, that this was a accident that resulted in a death, and there have been certain elements of the media that have put all of these other details and factors into the mix just to impart their own opinion. So it's kind of taken off in this cultural firestorm.
Yeah, it's certainly a cultural crime moment here with this story, and we'll be following the trial very closely. I'm sure a lot of our listeners will be as well. And you can check out Brad's podcast, The Crime Scene Weekly, which will also be covering the Karen Read trial. They've already done an episode, but I'm sure they will do more, because I think Brad is attending the trial, if I'm not mistaken, or at least covering it very closely.
All right, so we're going to break real quick for commercial, and we will return with our conversation with Brad Mielke about the Karen Read, John O'Keefe murder trial. And a thank you to our sponsors. Back to the program.
Welcome to the podcast. Brad Mielke, how are you today?
Doing well, guys. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us. We always love it when we have professionals in this industry who can join us, especially if a company like ABC reaches out and they're like, hey, we got this guy. He's an amazing journalist. He's got this great project. And we think that the two of you would have something in common. And we love that when that happens, because that way we get to make, a new friend on the show. And I've been pretty distracted during this intro because I choked and almost died. So I apologize for that.
Yeah, no, you've recovered. This is going, yeah.
This is going.
It was a close one.
Yeah, it was a close call, but we're all here.
My theory is Tim's trying to poison me.
From afar, remotely.
From afar. Yeah.
Hey, you never know.
Anyway.
So, yes, can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Well, it's interesting. So I've been a radio journalist now for the last 12 years or so. I came to ABC 2012, 2013. So I've kind of done everything there is to do in like the radio space. I've been a producer. I've been like the assistant. I've been like the editor and, the guy in the control room pushing the buttons. Then I finally was able to get on air and just started doing sort of general assignment reporting. I became a political reporter at one point. I was following the campaign back in 2016. I was like living in New Hampshire, following all these candidates around. And out of that, this fire hose of news started coming, with the Trump administration. There was just this fire hose of news where there's just so much news breaking overnight that we decided to create this daily podcast called Start Here. And that's where I sort of entered the podcasting space for the first time, right? That's where, every morning still we're covering several of the biggest stories of the day. However, some stories are easier to tell in like 5 or 10 minutes than others. And there's this whole area that I wanted to get more invested in, which is like the true crime space. Like there's so many fascinating stories out there. I feel like kind of a noob sometimes because there are so many investigations happening at any given time. And a lot of these stories take more than 10 minutes to explain what the heck is going on. So just this year, we decided we'd start this podcast called The Crime Scene Weekly, where we'd be able to sort of take a look at these sort of unfolding dramas that are happening all around us, which I know interest you guys as well. It's just been like this sort of roller coaster where I've almost been getting to know this scene and just how many different questions there can be about any given investigation at any given time.
You use the term fire hose of information, fire hose of news, and this is stemming from your experience in 2016 covering the politics then. What you did was channel all of that into something, like you said, could be distributed in a format that was more than 10 minutes, more than a few minutes of just like surface level information. That's the beauty of podcasting, is you can get deep into this. People put those earbuds in their ears and it becomes really personal.
Well, and it makes a difference, I think, in terms of like, you listen more closely almost to your friend who's describing something casually at a bar. You actually retain that more sometimes than the broadcaster who's like shouting into the microphone like, this is what the news is. Like it's almost easier to just follow a conversation when it is conversational. And I think that's sort of been the takeaway. And it's those off the cuff conversations, as long as you're sticking to the facts, as long as you're like imparting real information, you almost pick it up more easily in that format.
Yeah, that's actually exactly what I was getting to, which is most people don't like being talked at. They like feeling like they're part of it. And a lot of those news broadcasts just like slam it at you. And some people don't mind that. And that leads me to my question. What is it between people who want to be part of the conversation and people who want to be told that this is the conversation?
And this is where it's nice to be me in that I'm a journalist. I'm definitely not the most experienced journalist at ABC, right? Like I'm right there with a lot of our audience members being like, wait, what happened? Like, he said what? He tweeted what? Or like, can you do that? Or, wait, this war, it seems like they should just stop fighting, but they're not. Why don't they? Like, I'm right there with you. And so that's why I just get to ask the questions that I think a lot of us are sitting in our car, sitting, at our home washing the dishes, like shouting at our TV or our radio, be like, just explain this to me like I'm a normal human being, please. The advantage that I have is most people aren't surrounded by like an office full of world-class journalists. That's the advantage that I have, that I get to like literally run down our hallway sometime and be like, hey, David Muir, like, would you want to come on and just like explain the story? Like, I know you talked to the guy one-on-one. Could you do this? And they'll say yes, shockingly often.
Very cool. So are you enjoying producing Crime Scene Weekly?
I think it's going really well. We have a weekly episode, obviously. It has to sort of fill two boxes. It has to like hit two check marks. One is that it has to be new. It has to be like popping right now. There needs to be a reason that like it's sort of on the scene of this true crime space that we all enjoy. But it also has to have enough depth. I think there have to be these stories that have this sort of depth that make you keep asking questions, that keep you invested. And so far, I think we found some really good ones. I mean, some of them are very zeitgeisty stories that we've all been following like since we were probably kids. Like we did like the Tupac Shakur killing, but because there's these new developments where the guy is actually going to trial. You know, we covered the Menendez story because they might be getting out of jail if they have their way. But then there's this whole prosecutorial drama and everything. And the Karen Reed story is like, it's even a different level where it's not something we grew up with, but it has become this like all-encompassing story. So that's why we chose those as like our first three.
And when we were contacted to see if we would be interested to have you on, we said absolutely. And then we found out that the Karen Reed story was very much on your radar. Tim and I are in Massachusetts.
Oh.
It's basically in our backyards. Speaking of backyards, I can look out my window right now and I can see a little lawn sign that says "Free Karen Reed."
Really? So it's like that. It is that personal to people. That's what's so interesting about it, I think.
And that sign's been there since about a week after it. I saw that sign and I was like, "Who's Karen Reed?" This was a couple of years ago, and I had to look it up. So speaking of stories with depth, that's one we're going to get into here.
And it is a story that kind of like, it's existed in every medium, right? It's existed on your like local television affiliate, but it also like completely blew up online. We can talk about this more, but like that I think is why you've got such a wide variety of people who immediately knew what was going on, because it was like exploding in various online neighborhoods.
Right, but it seems like everyone feels like they know what's going on, but they have vastly different ideas of what actually happened. So I'm curious, how did you cover this case on the Crime Scene Weekly? Were you able to learn from the ABC archives?
So again, this is the advantage of being with ABC. So we have this team throughout ABC. We have entire teams that are dedicated to covering these long evolving stories, right? We've got our investigative unit that sometimes they'll go under the hood for 2 years on a given story. We've got 2020. They can crash an episode over the course of a week if they need to, but often these are journalists who are digging very, very deep, crossing all their T's, dotting all their I's for months and months to put together an hour of television. And so everything is sort of fact and refact checked, and we actually do get access to the people involved, and we can, ask sort of the characters what they think. We can hold public officials sort of accountable for what they've said on the record, get them on the record. And so what we did was, at the crime scene, we were able to go to our friends at 2020 and basically say, can you give us everything you've got on the Karen Reed saga? Specifically, I met up with Matt Gutman, who's ABC's chief national correspondent. And he's based in LA, but he's been flying back and forth to Massachusetts for like the last year of his life covering this for 2020. And he was telling me early on, he was like, I don't think I've seen a case quite like this before in my 15 years at 2020. He and I have a conversation on the crime scene, but then we also get access to all these different elements. Like he was the only reporter who got access to a interview with Karen Reed herself before her trial, her first trial. Like think about that. That's insane. Like what defense attorney is like, yeah. I want you to speak to my client before she actually faces a jury. That's a good idea. We should do that.
That's crazy. We are going to get into this. We're going to go down the rabbit hole a little bit. Before we do that, can you give the listeners an overview of the Karen Reed story?
Yeah. So it's 2022. It's January. It's a winter night. In fact, it's like a historic snowstorm. I think it ends up snowing more than 20 inches or something. Karen Reed is with her Boston police officer boyfriend, John O'Keefe. And like you do on a winter night in Massachusetts, go out drinking with the boys, right? And that's what John O'Keefe did. He brought Karen Reed along. They're out with all these other cops. Party eventually goes back to another police officer's house. Karen Reed says, I'm actually going to bail. John O'Keefe is still there. The way she tells it, she wakes up in the middle of the night and John O'Keefe is still not home. She's trying to figure out where he is. Eventually, she goes back to that house where there was a party. She says that she finds him unresponsive in a snowbank outside of that home. He's brought to the hospital. He's pronounced dead. The doctors say that he died of a head injury, but also hypothermia, just sitting out in the cold. What prosecutors will say happened is that Karen Reed hit him, that she was, everyone had been drinking. She hits him with her SUV. She got damage to her car. There's even video of this from I think it's a surveillance footage. You can actually hear her saying something like, I hit him. She would say that she was asking, did I hit him? Because this is where the contention is when did he die and Was it because she hit him with her car? Because then she goes home and now she's been charged with second-degree murder. She's been charged with manslaughter, and she's been charged with fleeing the scene because she just allegedly bounced after hitting him with her car.
Wow. Okay. So she allegedly hit him with the car and then she went home. Were they living together?
Yeah, so they were living together, but they did have this contentious, some would say even like contemptuous relationship. Like there was a lot of testimony of drunken fights, of screaming fights, even at night, of Karen Reed calling him terrible things. And so this kind of painted this picture of somebody who, in sort of a drunken rage, hits her boyfriend with her car and then goes, oh no, need to cover this up, and flees. The interesting thing is that Karen Reed says that's actually not what happened. I showed up and just found him. And to that point, her team says that this investigation seemed kind of shoddy from the start and there might be something different happening. But if what the defense is alleging is true, it would involve a pretty massive cover-up by the police officers that were at this house. It's a pretty simple story if you think that it's just like, oh, drunk person is really angry with their significant other, hits them with the car, sort of tries to cover it up, goes to sleep, act like there was nothing there. That's pretty open and shut. If it's the way the defense is describing it, it's a huge story. And it's really swept up so many people in Massachusetts because of it.
All right, so that takes us into the stages leading into the first trial. How did the media handle the coverage on that? What was the difference between certain media outlets, and how did they feed into the different conspiracies?
Well, this is what's interesting is, again, the Occam's razor approach of like simplest explanation is probably the most probable explanation that the prosecution's describing. Is, again, it's pretty simple. Standard media approach is you'll say, here's what the prosecution's saying, here's what the defense is saying. We'll see what happens, right? Like everyone sort of deserves their moment in court. We're going to investigate all the details there. But you also had new media there, including this sort of local vlogger that calls himself Turtle Boy. Turtle Boy starts taking some of the inconsistencies that the defense is alleging here and really blows them up into something that becomes almost a political movement in this part of Massachusetts. He starts sort of recruiting people into this idea that there was this massive police conspiracy where here's the theory from the defense. Okay. So the defense would say that John O'Keefe is there at this house with these cops who don't necessarily like him, actually, that he walked into kind of an ambush, that there was a fight, almost an attack on him. That's where the head trauma would come from, they said. And then he gets dumped outside the house in the cold. That's how he dies. Then, because the defense would say these are cops who all kind of know the investigators. The investigators, they say, did a terrible job at sort of controlling the scene. Yes, the defense says there's damage to Karen Reed's car, but that all of the evidence was collected in like plastic cups on the ground. You know how usually you'd like secure the scene, you put the little evidence markers down? That's not what police did here. Like they used like, I don't know if it was Dixie cups, but like that sort of a thing where you're using like little plastic cups to secure your evidence. Somebody used a leaf blower to get rid of the snow. Like these are all sort of what the defense would say are complete no-nos in the crime scene world. And that points to the idea that perhaps these cops had something to hide and that they all kind of knew the investigator. By the way, the lead investigator in this case has had terrible things to say about Karen Reed. At one point, his text messages were revealed calling her like terrible names. Doesn't necessarily mean that she's not guilty, but this sort of sign to the defense that if the cops decide they are going to pin this on her, to them that seems like evidence. You also then have this Google search where at the house outside where John O'Keefe is found, a computer in that house has a Google search on it at one point that says, house long to die in cold. House long to die in the cold, which seems like the typo version of how long to die in the cold, right? The defense says that Google search was entered at 2:30 in the morning before Karen Reed comes back, before she would have known that he was dead. So if you had somebody in that house Googling how long to die in the cold, that would point to the idea, theoretically, that people in the house knew he was out there potentially dying and just left him there for hours and hours. Again, he's found after 6 a.m. by the people in the house because Karen Reed is there. So if those things are true, that points to this massive cover-up. Turtle Boy, going back to your question about sort of new media, Turtle Boy starts shouting this from the rooftops and actually gets very aggressive with how he's describing this to people in the online space. He's even been charged with stalking people around these police officers who were there that night who say, of course, they had nothing to do with it. We should make it clear. Like, they all completely have denied, some of them even denied being in that house overnight. But he even started showing up to like kids' soccer games. and at the first trial, people start showing up on the courthouse steps, so incensed by what they've been seeing, online, that they're even shouting at the family of the victim. I mean, that's how intense this all got. And again, this is sort of the difference of how the media coverage is that you're describing. There's telling the story, and then there's sort of taking an activist role in the story. Sort of all of the above have happened. And that's why you got, again, like lawn signs from people early on being like, free Karen Read. There's a very healthy movement. There's a very prodigious movement in Massachusetts saying that this is all a sham.
I want to talk about how Turtle Boy energized so many people, but I do want to mention real quick, we used to have an office in Worcester, Mass, and we were right down the street from the Turtle Boy statue. I don't know if you know that he got his name from this statue.
Wait, he has a statue?
Not of him.
Oh, it's not of him. Okay, I was like, wait, he built a statue for Turtle Boy.
A very strange statue made by an artist who I believe had some mental illness and committed suicide, I think, shortly after. And when you look at the statue, you'll be like, wow, I have no idea why this is happening in this statue. So to take your name from that anyway was a little weird, but I am curious, like, how the hell did he energize so many people?
I mean, I think he pointed to a lot of inconsistencies that he thought were going unaddressed. When we're talking about the, investigator having terrible things to say about Karen Read, he didn't think that that was being made enough of. You look at sort of the timeline of the night and that Google search that can seem very damning, and he says that's not getting enough play. However, we should say with the Google search, prosecution says the timeline is off. They say, yes, that tab was open at 2:30 in the morning, so it looks pretty bad. But that the Google search, that doesn't mean that's when the search terms were entered. They say the search terms were entered after 6 a.m., hours later, because Karen Read shows up, starts going, oh no, I found him. I found him. Did I hit him? Or I hit him. And that then everyone rushes inside in a panic and goes, wait, is he dying? Is he dead? How long to die in the cold? How long to die in the cold? So that's why the prosecution says, again, you're leaping to conclusions here if you kind of want there to be a conspiracy. But when you frame it in the way that Turtle Boy was framing it, it's super compelling. And it all speaks, I think, to like the central focus of this case, which is it's a setting where there are so many cops, right? If you trust the police, you think to yourself, wow, this is a terrible thing that happened to this police officer. Simplest explanation is the most probable explanation. If you don't trust the police, you think to yourself, oh, what are these guys doing when they all get together and someone dies? How would they handle it? And would they pin it on somebody? Would they pin it on the girlfriend? And I think that strikes a deep chord with people depending on where you stand on the cops. I'm not going to get into like whether it's the right thing or the wrong thing to do, but I'm just saying like it certainly like fans the flames that people feel rightly with this case. It's a super divisive issue how police handle their investigations.
How aggressively Turtle Boy fanned those flames, we can say that he had a choice, though, to continue that aggression or to pull back. And I guess this is an opinion question that I have for you as a journalist. When you get to that crossroad, what is going through your mind? Is it similar to what would be going through Turtle Boy's mind when he realizes, I've just galvanized a lot of people and I have the power to go one way or the other, or I could take a step back?
I don't think it's for me to say. I think that the way, we cover the news is we try to just be straightforward about here's what the facts of the case are. Here's what two different sides are saying. And it's not like everything's created equal, right? If you notice inconsistencies in one side's story, you call them out and then you try to get people on the record. But you've got to do it in a way that then keeps people's trust in you across the board, right? You want to know that you're still giving each side a fair shake, basically. I don't particularly have an opinion on how any other media outlets are covering it, but I do think that in the modern sort of information space, it's just a question of who your audience is, right? And how involved you want to be in the story. I think that when you look around the world, there's a lot of news outlets that they get very involved in the stories. And I think generally ABC, our job is just to be straightforward, present the facts as we know them, and tell the audience what we've learned.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
So then the trial is moving forward. People are trying to figure out how to process all this information. Can you just take us through the trial a little bit, the first trial?
What's interesting about this trial is that the lawyer for Karen Reed, you're not going to find a lawyer in history that believes his client more than this lawyer believes Karen Reed. Again, that's why this lawyer actually makes Karen Reed available to ABC before the trial even begins, because he doesn't just think like she's a decent defendant. Like he's like, she's right. Like she is telling the truth. You can almost tell like that's how he feels about this. And so the defense is super vociferous about trying to introduce this evidence. They highlight the inconsistencies. The prosecution, again, makes their case of this is the simplest possible explanation. Just because you're using plastic cups to collect evidence doesn't mean the evidence isn't real, right? Like it's still there. So just because there was a big snowstorm that night doesn't mean that like the crime scene is impossible to secure. After 9 weeks, I think 5 days of deliberation, the jury finds themselves just unable to reach a unanimous verdict. What's interesting is the defense would say they heard later from members of the jury. This is how the defense describes it. They say that jurors were in the room and that they had actually decided they were unanimous on a couple of these charges. That they said, we all agree she did not commit second-degree murder, and we all agree that she did not intentionally flee the scene of a crime. So we should acquit her on those. But we're not quite sure what to do about the manslaughter charge. There's some holdouts. We can't quite agree. That's what the defense says. However, that's not what happened in the courtroom. As far as the official record goes, this was a mistrial. They couldn't come to an agreement. So the defense has this question of, wait, did they understand what it means to declare a mistrial on certain charges? Do they know how to deliver a partial verdict? The defense says that there shouldn't even be a second trial for all three of these charges, that it should just be a manslaughter charge. But that's sort of, again, what creates so much controversy in the second trial now.
And so the first trial ended in a mistrial or a hung jury? So it's been a year or so since that, and now we're back about to begin this second trial. And what are the charges she's facing now?
So it's the same three charges. It's still the second-degree murder, it's still the manslaughter, and it's still the fleeing the scene of the crime. But there have been developments. Like this trial is going to look significantly different for a few reasons. One is the lawyers. The prosecution has now tapped Hank Berman to be their lead prosecutor and special counsel. Hank Berman is the lawyer who represented the Boston gangster James Whitey Bulger, right? So like this is a big deal lawyer. He's going to be special counsel for the prosecution. On the defense side, they've gotten a new member of their legal team, a lawyer named Victoria George. Victoria George happens to be an alternate juror on that first case.
I just read that earlier. How is that possible?
So obviously you would never be a lawyer on a case and then selected as a juror, but lawyers don't have to be impartial. That's not that's not part of the brief. You don't have to be impartial. So you can hire whoever you want, especially like as a consultant. And if you're the defense, it makes sense. Wait, there was a lawyer on the jury bench. Now, she's an alternate, so she's not one of the people that even had, like, she didn't cast a vote on any of these things, right? But you're thinking to yourself as the defense, wait, she's a lawyer. She was in the room. She might not have been in the deliberations, but she certainly, like, looked at the evidence and probably had strong thoughts about this. Like, what stuck out to her, what didn't? What parts of our case made sense? What witness testimony fell flat? That would all be really valuable information to have. But when people heard like, oh my gosh, a former juror, it's something you don't see very often.
That's actually kind of brilliant for them to do that.
Like, it's a smart move. It's just something that you so rarely think of lawyers even being on juries, but they are. I've been on a jury.
Reminds me of something out of like the WWE though, or something like that. Like it's
like a heel turn.
Yeah, it's like a weird tactic. Now, how did she even get on the jury to begin with the first time? Wouldn't being a lawyer, make you not able to? No?
Not necessarily, because I'll just speak from my personal experience. I was on a jury once. I was on a jury for a felony murder case. In the box, they're doing the interviews, and they'll ask you, what do you do for a living? They'll ask you. And I remember saying, like, I'm a journalist. This was a killing that involved, like, a cop getting killed. And so it's a high-profile trial. And so I was assuming, like, they would never want a journalist in the jury pool. That'd be crazy.
Well, one side, right?
Well, and just in general, I imagine they'd be like, oh, like, you're going to feel like the need to report on this, and we don't want news leaking out from the jury. But then they asked me, like, would that conflict with your thing? And I was like, no, if you're asking me if I can be impartial, like, that's my whole job. I'm fine. Would you report on this? No, I wouldn't. I think it's the same sort of question for a lawyer, right? Like, in fact, lawyers know the law. If your job as a juror is to disregard stuff that you've seen outside the room and just focus on the stuff that is admissible in court, a lawyer can be a perfectly fine juror as long as you can convince people that you're going to be impartial. I don't think it's actually that rare. What's rare is for then there to be a retrial of that exact case, and for one of the sides to go like, "Hey, let's interview you." And I imagine perhaps they spoke to her after, and then she says like, "Yeah, I was kind of on your guys' side." That's me speculating, but I imagine that might be how you land on that person.
Well, now that we're talking about the jury, how do you select a jury for something that's this high profile? It's already been done once.
This is the thing. And again, this is what I think makes this case so interesting, is it is hard to not have heard about this in this part of Massachusetts at this point. And that's not to say that a jury has to have not heard of the case. That's actually not the issue. The issue is that you can't have made up your mind about the case, and that you can't be so influenced by, say, conspiracy theories, say, or the prosecution's case. You don't want jurors that think they know everything going into it. And that's going to be hard. The other thing I think that is tough is a lot of this is going to come down to how people feel about police. Do police lie? Pretty basic question, but people have very strong opinions on that. The difference with this case is also what the defense is allowed to offer as a defense. So in the first case, the judge tells you, here's sort of the cases you're allowed to make, here's the evidence you're allowed to bring in. The first case, it was just, our job is to prove that it wasn't necessarily Karen Reed that did this. In this case, the defense will be allowed to try something called the third-party culprit defense. That the judge has said, you are allowed to go up there and tell the jury, not only did Karen Reed not do this, we know who did. Here's who did it. It was these guys in the house, say, right? And again, they've all denied doing that. But the defense, unlike the first trial, will be allowed to present this theory more clearly to the jury. And why I think that matters is, again, if you have jurors in the box who are predisposed to go, oh, yeah, cops would totally do that. That case now becomes that much more compelling. It's no longer just a case about Karen Reed to that juror, perhaps, even though she's the only one on trial. She's the only one who's been charged. But the fact that the defense can even make that case, I think will have a significant impact on how each side is thinking about their juror selections.
As folks like Lance and I, who have covered a lot of unsolved cases, missing persons cases, we often talk to people who have theories of what might have happened. And oftentimes, the more specific you get on a theory, the more you lose the audience. So I wonder how that kind of idea might impact this trial if they're going to present a theory that may or may not have happened.
I think the timeline is everything with this case. Did Karen Reed leave the place, come back and hit him? Did she leave the place, come back and just find somebody there? Was a Google search made at this time versus that time? I think sort of the timeline of when all this happens is going to matter. But you're right that once you start digging into like, oh, this Google search actually might not have happened at 2:30. It could have happened at 5:30, or it could have happened at 6:30. That's when something that sounds, again, if you're predisposed to believing a certain thing, that's when it can start feeling a lot tougher and tougher to prove. Again, the onus is on the prosecution to prove that, yes, this is what happened, that, yes, she hit him with her car and then left him there to die. That's what they're going to have to prove.
Why did she go back to the house?
Well, that's the thing. In her story, she just woke up and went, I don't know where he is. He should be here by now. I'm going to go back to the house. And that's when she finds him. The prosecution would say that's her looking like she's coming back to find him, but in reality, she'd already basically run him over or smacked him with her car hours prior, and then was just trying to make it look good. And because it was this historic snowstorm, even if you thought I hurt him, leaving him there in that weather would amount to what they would say is murder at that point. You know he's going to die.
So it's either we believe that version, or we believe that police who were in the house, who weren't exactly friends with Mr. O'Keefe, left him outside knowingly to die, knowing that there would be this, investigation and likely court at some point. It's a little hard to believe that there wouldn't be some other acts done there. If they really were trying to kill someone and get away with it, I don't know that leaving him out front is really the best way to go, because again, you know the steps that are going to happen afterwards, and that's going to be a whole thing.
And then you have to square that with, is the plan to always pin it on Karen Reed? Is that always the plan? Because then there's stuff that's perhaps out of your control later. and then you're trying to sort of fix evidence after the fact. But that's exactly what the defense would say happened, that these are cops who basically all knew each other. They knew the lead investigators in the case. One of the lead investigators actually reassigned at the end of all this, that there's a reason that happened. But again, that's the sort of onus that you're then putting on the defense if they're trying to make this case that, we know what happened, here's what happened. You have to sort of piece all that together pretty clearly.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
How do you see the media approaching the second trial? Do you think it's going to be even more of a media storm, or do you think they're going to learn from some of the mistakes from the first trial?
I mean, no, I think it's going to be a big trial, especially because the judge has said that this sort of third-party culprit defense is a legitimate defense, and it's legitimate enough for the defense to bring up. I think that sort of makes it even more of a wild story to describe, and sort of describing both of these scenarios. I think Karen Read has become sort of like you said, a cause unto herself at this point with so many people in Massachusetts that I think both local and national media are going to be paying a lot of attention.
Do you think we can handle it? I mean, there's just so much happening all the time that's just like so overwhelming. I don't know if I can handle this.
That's what I'm here for. That's what you're here for. Wait,
Wait, whoa.
I know you can handle it.
I mean, yes, I can handle it, but the average person probably,
right.
Yes.
And this is, I think, the interesting thing about sort of dipping my toe into this true crime space that we're occupying is you can kind of pursue rabbit holes endlessly, and yet at some point it can feel all of a sudden like you don't want to lose focus from the thing that has actually happened and the things that are actually affecting all of us, right? You don't want to focus so hard on one case that becomes like the only story out there, because there are so many interesting cases out there that all have so many of these cases are not just about the murder. So many of these cases are not just about the kidnapping. A lot of it has to do, like this case, I think, is how you feel about police, right? Like that I think is the interesting thing here. That's why we're talking about it. The Menendez case is not about parental murder necessarily. And it's not even necessarily about sex abuse, which is what the Menendez brothers have claimed was sort of the impetus for all this. It's more about, if what they're saying is true, can we forgive as a society, or is a life sentence a life sentence? No ifs, ands, and buts about it. Those are like the questions that I think we're all actually in this space. That's what's so interesting about these true crime spaces, these true crime stories. I think that's why they've sort of remained endlessly fascinating. But you, again, have to sort of stick to the facts of what they are and be fair to the people that are involved in them, because they're not just, we call them characters so often. They're not just characters. All these are real people with real skin in the game.
Yeah, and I do think it's going to be tough to get a unanimous conviction here because of all these things we're speaking about. The first investigator, that was Michael Proctor. He was the one who was reassigned.
Yeah, Michael Proctor was the lead investigator, and he was put on leave and later then fired from the police force.
Right. So there's something for the anti-police people to really kind of sink their teeth in on.
There's a difference between misconduct. There's a difference between, saying things that you shouldn't about the defendant, between that and actually manipulating evidence, which he and any of the other investigators here have all denied.
But he was also, and correct me if I'm wrong, but he was also the one who had sent text messages about Karen Read and about the way she looked and things like that.
Right.
So that's kind of a, showing bias, I guess, in your investigation. So that's a pretty big no-no, I would say, as well.
Yeah, I was going to say, he admitted to, and just specifically, he admitted to calling her a whack job. He texted his own sister that he wished Read would kill herself. Like, that's the sort of text that we're talking about here. Doesn't necessarily mean that you manipulated evidence. That's the marker here, right? That's what we actually care about, is not how he felt necessarily, but did how he felt, did that then influence his investigation? Would that make him more amenable to working with police who wanted to cover something up? That's sort of the reason we care.
The impression that the masses get when they see that headline that he was put on leave and subsequently fired, there's no reasons behind that would ever not be salacious to them. You know what I mean? Like, the masses will start talking and say, well, did you hear? Did you hear the lead investigator? They fired him.
Right.
That's where the conversation starts, not minutiae, details of why he was put on leave. But that's the resonating phrase that, gets told to your neighbors and your friends.
Now, how is this culture of non-journalists like Turtle Boy and, some podcasters, TikTokers, YouTubers, things like that? Like, how is that seen by actual journalists like you?
I think what journalism is just bearing witness to something. Like, there's actually, if you look at like laws around journalism, there's not a whole lot of rights that journalists have that go beyond the average citizen, because that's what journalism is just being like a citizen who bothers to show up. You know, there are some like high government things where like you have to get like a special pass to cover the thing, but that's only because you're like a known journalist. Most of these things are just like bothering to show up to the crime scene and ask the police what you want to know. Anyone can do that. That's how these newspapers started 100 years ago, was just like people showing up being like, I'd like to know this, please. Showing up to the press conference and asking a question. There's not a huge difference, really. The difference at this point is when you're part of an organization like ABC, you really want to make sure that you're representing the organization well. You want to make sure that you're creating the sense of trust with your listeners, with your viewers, that you're not only covering this story fairly, but you're going to cover every other story fairly. You don't want that sort of thing of like, oh, well, remember what Brad asked at that press conference? He sounded like a jerk. How can I really trust ABC on the other stories they cover? That's the risk. I don't think there's a big problem with people wanting to get more involved with getting people on the record and telling stories in a truthful, accurate way, as long as it's truthful, accurate, and fair. And that's what, we're here to do, is just make sure that everyone knows we're on the level, that we're being fair, and that we're showing our work.
Because you can do it disingenuously. And I'm not saying Turtle Boy or other people have done it in this case, but it's definitely out there online. I see it every day in political media and certain other cases. You can lie and people will believe you.
Right. I was going to say, there are questions sometimes as a journalist that you always have about like, should I include this? Should I include that? It's not even necessarily that it's not stuff that's untrue. You would never say something that's untrue. You shouldn't ever say anything that's untrue. But highlighting something over something else that gives the audience the impression that this thing is more believable than that thing. Those are the choices that like you have to consider really carefully. For instance, the old criticism of journalism being almost too 50-50 is that you'd say like, so-and-so says it's raining, where really you should be saying it's raining. Like we can call. Like we should be able to say that. And to act as if like there's a question about that in itself is disingenuous. To tell one person's side of the story and not the other in other times, though, is very disingenuous. So you have to sort of give people let them each have their say. But it doesn't mean necessarily that it's just he said, she said, it's all a 50-50 coin toss. Like I think there's a place for sort of activist journalism. It's just not what we do.
I really wanted your answer to be, well, I've won an Edward R. Murrow award and Turtle Boy has not. That's what I wanted your answer to be.
I would never, because the awards are just the bonus for the actual work. The work is the fun part. The work is the actual thing that if I was showing up for awards to work every day, it would be a very lonely job, because those are, can't count on those things.
Plus, Turtle Boy's got a statue of himself.
That's what I want.
I need you to Google Turtle Boy statue Worcester, and I want to see your reaction in real time.
Turtle Boy statue Worcester. Oh God. What is this?
Exactly. It exists.
This is like a dude it's like a naked dude with like a Greek sort of leafy headband thing, kind of riding a turtle, straddling a turtle.
We're hoping riding.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just kind of riding.
Neighborhood. Yeah.
Yep.
Huh.
That's right in the center of Worcester.
And wait, this is how he got the nickname?
Yes.
See, this is going to be episode 2 of the Karen Reed story on Crime Scene Weekly. We're going to investigate this more.
Maybe in the future they'll be handing out little Turtle Boy statues with the Greek male fairy riding the turtle.
I don't know if I'd want this nickname. I thought it was a weird nickname. Now I really don't know if I'd want this nickname. Oh.
Yeah. So what are you expecting to happen in this second trial? And how long is this going to go?
In this new trial, I think it could be even more drawn out because of some of the things that we've already talked about, right? I think that the fact that the defense is going to try to make an even more robust case about what they think happened, I think that could drag it out even more. I think they'll have a better sense of what they want to hit the prosecution on. The prosecution, I think, knows they have to bring it effectively, right? The prosecution, and now they've got a new lawyer, like I said, this very prestigious lawyer. So I could imagine this going on even further. We saw jury selection take several days just to fill out a jury pool, just to fill out the jury box. It took quite a while. So I could imagine that this goes on even longer than the first, and that it's even more contentious because of what you could hear on the witness stand.
My prediction is that she gets off But I think she's guilty. That's my take.
Interesting. And that's a super plausible scenario, right? Because you do need that unanimous guilty verdict. Like if there's one juror that essentially it doesn't necessarily acquit her, but it would force another trial and another trial after that. So it's super, super possible that is exactly what happens.
Oh, hey, I totally forgot to ask this question. Why is this not a case of double jeopardy? Because it was a mistrial?
Because it's a mistrial, right? Because if they had acquitted her, and that's what the case that the defense made was 2 of these charges were decided, is what they would say. In the jury room, if the jury had known what they were allowed to do, that you're allowed to say, we find her not guilty on this, we find her not guilty on that, we can't come to a decision on manslaughter. That's totally possible for a jury to do. The defense says that they didn't know they were allowed to do that. But by then it was over. And again, this is just like what the defense says they've heard from former jurors. If it doesn't happen on the record, though, in that moment, you're not allowed to get the jury back together. You're not allowed to get the band back together and be like, hey, by the way, was this what you guys were deciding in the room? Like the moment has passed. So it's not going to happen again. But the defense says that's actually what happened, that this would, in fact, be a case of double jeopardy because 2 of these charges were decided. But they weren't. On the record, they were not decided either way, so they can retry all of these.
Very interesting stuff here, Brad. Thank you so much for spending some time with us today. What else is coming up on the Crime Scene Weekly?
We just taped our most recent episode about the Diddy trial, because the Diddy trial, it feels like it's kind of been swirling around us, right? Like, oh, Diddy, and like there's all these allegations, and there's the freak-off parties and stuff like that. The trial is about to happen. You got to imagine, we talk about how powerful the Karen Read case has been in Massachusetts. The Diddy trial is going to be insane. Just the amount of star power, the amount of national and international recognition, the amount of money that flows around the Diddy empire is going to be big. And it starts in couple weeks from when we're taping. ABC actually has a whole other podcast dedicated to the Diddy trial that we just launched. And so me and the host of that, Brian Buckmeyer, will be talking about sort of what to watch there, just get you teed up for it.
The door is always open here if you want to give the listeners an update on the Diddy trial. If you want to come back on whenever you're able to, doors open.
Awesome.
We love your work. We love the approach that you take, and we appreciate being in some way part of your orbit here, being in your orbit.
I'm honored to be part of the community, right? This true crime community that you guys are a part of. I'm like finally really sort of enjoying this. Just a few episodes in, it's been eye-opening for me, and I'm so excited that ABC is kind of leaning into it.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much, Brad. This has been a great chat.
Thanks, guys. It's been fun.